one, to study and develop reparations proposals. Two, to recommend the appropriate ways to educate the California public and the nation of the task force's findings. And three, to recommend appropriate remedies. The task force began in June of 2021 and is required to issue a report in two parts. Part one of the report catalogs the harm and was released on June 1, 2022, and I'll summarize it shortly. Part two, to be released in June of 2023, will discuss examples of reparations domestically and internationally, responsibility to pay reparations, the federal government, state of California, private actors, among others, define the form of reparations and how reparations might be calculated. So on June 1, the task force released a sweeping, nearly 500-page report, drawing a through line from the harm of 250 years of enslavement and racial terror, 90 years of Jim Crow exclusion, and decades more of continuing discrimination, resulting in today's outcomes, which are at once shocking but not surprising. America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. The wholesale historical exclusion of African Americans from equal education, employment, the benefits of the New Deal, federally insured home loans, the suburbs, and other opportunities that created America's middle class has resulted in, as Rodney pointed out, white households having 9 times more assets than black households, and huge disparities that persist in housing, houselessness, policing, criminal justice, and in almost all other aspects of American life. So the interim report has 13 chapters, and I'm sure Tamika will make this available, the link available to you. It's free and downloadable. And the chapters are as follows: the institution of slavery, commencing with the transatlantic slave trade, with slavery and white supremacy as foundations for colonial America and the founding of the United States, as Rodney mentioned. To the Civil War, the undermining of Reconstruction, and the reneging of reparations promises such as the 40 acres and a mule, the theft of land, wages, businesses, and so on. There's a chapter on political disenfranchisement by violence, poll taxes, literacy tests, and other voter suppression tactics to modern day gerrymandering that we're seeing going on in other states. With respect to housing, for 120 plus years following the Civil War, governments acting together with private interests caused cities to be racially segregated through violence, through zoning, through redlining, and restrictive covenants. In education, this chapter recounts 250 years of prohibiting literacy of the enslaved, followed by multiple strategies to limit or deny education and to segregate it, to be sure. Racial terror. The end of slavery was followed by 95 years of terrorism, lynching, mob violence, mass murder, and vigilantism as a form of social control. There's a section on public health and mental health. Enslavement established the foundation for discriminatory healthcare systems that persist today. From the very beginnings of medical experimentation, treating African Americans as human guinea pigs, such as in the Tuskegee experiments, to disparities that persist today, such as Black women suffering 3 to 5 times the rate of infant mortality and complications as compared to other ethnic groups. In the environment, zoning and redline pushed polluting industries into Black neighborhoods. In the justice system, from slave codes to Black codes to post-emancipation vagrancy laws criminalizing ordinary behavior, which is seen in the modern day driving while Black police stops, and in law and order, war on drugs, tough on crime policies, which have resulted in mass incarceration. In arts and culture and faith, there's a chapter on that, where in religious institutions that profited from slavery, the racist stereotypes that were so prevalent in the entertainment industry, monuments honoring the Confederacy and white supremacists, exclusion and exploitation of Black museums, Black musicians, artists, and athletes, and this is something very much that happened in Las Vegas. The family this chapter discusses the devastating impact of slavery and the policies and laws that followed on Black families. There's a section on labor, the exclusion of Black Americans from employment following emancipation, sharecropping, keeping formerly enslaved people perpetually in debt, and convict leasing, resupplying former slave owners with labor, wage theft enforced by racial violence, New Deal protections, excluding agricultural and domestic services, which jobs were overwhelmingly held by African Americans, and the rampant racism in unions of yesteryear. The wealth accumulation and the contemporary racial wealth gap is a separate chapter in and of itself, which goes into the consequences of centuries of policies restricting Black Americans' ability to build, maintain, and pass on wealth. I do want to say a few words about California because you might see parallels in Nevada's history. While California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state, it was plenty complicit with enslavers entering California and taking their human property with them. California's 1849 anti-slavery state constitution meant little because it was not a crime to keep someone enslaved. There were no laws to free enslaved people or to punish enslavers, or laws to protect African Americans from being kidnapped and enslaved or re-enslaved. From 1852 to 1855, the California legislature passed fugitive slave laws, allowing anyone accused of escaping enslavement to be chased down, dragged before court, and sent back to the South, even if they had been living in the free state of California. During Reconstruction, that brief period between 1865 and 1877, when Congress sought to protect the rights of newly freed Black Americans, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, ostensibly guaranteeing the equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, ostensibly prohibiting states from discriminating against voters on the basis of race. But California officials openly refused to abide by the 15th Amendment. California's Attorney General instructed county clerks not to register Black voters until Congress passed legislation commanding them to do so. It would take California nearly another decade to change its constitution in 1879 to partly conform to the 15th Amendment's requirements, and nearly another century to formally ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments in 1959 and in 1962, respectively. The Civil War, as you know, had ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished, but about 5 minutes after Robert E. Lee surrendered, the South was determined to reinstate policies and practices as close to slavery as possible. And much of Jim Crow found its way into California. Democrats came to power in 1867 by promising white voters that they would fight against any new laws that would make African Americans, Native Americans, or Chinese Americans equal to whites. White supremacy groups flourished in the West. In the 1920s, California became a strong Klan state with sizable and violent Klan resurgences emerging in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose. Glendale, Pasadena, Culver City, California were sundown towns, excluding African Americans through laws, intimidation, or violence. Federal, state, and local government officials, working with private individuals, actively segregated American land into Black and white neighborhoods. These are just examples. The Federal Housing Administration, Veterans Administration, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation helped millions of white Americans buy houses while refusing the same opportunity to Black Americans. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in home loans, 98% of which went to white people. California was a leader in racially restrictive covenants. By 1940, 80% of the homes in Los Angeles contained racially restrictive covenants barring Black families. In 1956, so-called urban renewal policies enabled San Francisco to condemn and tear down the Fillmore district, resulting in 20,000 Black residents being displaced and 883 Black-owned businesses destroyed. In the next decade, the Japanese American community in which my family lived was targeted, and that used to be 44 blocks before urban redevelopment reduced it to 4 blocks. And the eminent domain also resulted in the loss of my family's property. This pattern has been repeated all over America. And, Rodney mentioned freeways. Parks is another way of entire Black communities basically being destroyed. And so I'm going to stop here in respect of the other panelists' time, and I thank you for allowing me to present.
Thank you so much for some of the background and context of what went into California and some of the areas that they're looking at where harm was done as a larger and bigger picture and even after slavery, as you stated in yours. We're going to go ahead and move to our next panelist, which is Commissioner McCurdy. So we're going to go ahead and start with you. The question we have for you is, what do you see as a potential problem with the measures similar to what Mr. Tamaki just spoke about in California's?
Well, first and foremost, I think that this is a very good discussion, very timely, and in fact, I believe that there is a lot of opportunity in the moment that we find ourselves in. As to the issues that I see with the bill, or with the information that has been gathered and also that has been shared with us this evening, is that when it comes time to identify, who should receive, for example, payment for work that was performed under brutal conditions, one of the most inhumane acts of violence that have ever been documented. The question is should it be descendants of slaves, those who can trace their lineage? I see issues that could possibly stem from that, as well as issues with those who may not be able to, identify their lineage. They may not be able to track back as far as they may need to determine that they are truly a descendant of slavery. What we do know is that there were over 4 million Africans and their descendants who were enslaved in America between 1619 and 1865. And as Don stated, we know that there was over 90 years of Jim Crow. So the question that I would say is, do we stop at just compensation? It should not stop at just compensation. We know that we have families all across, not only Black communities in Southern Nevada and Nevada, but all across the nation, who still have not been able to decompress from slavery. We are still walking around with the trauma and the effects of slavery. So not only should there be compensation, but there should also include some type of rehabilitation, acknowledgement of the injustice. We know that there has been recent symbols to recognize slavery and freedom in America, of Black folks in America, with Juneteenth and the federal legislation, but there has yet to be anything to back that up. And I believe that, again, now is the time. We have to have a keen focus on education and educational reforms as it relates to educational attainment in the Black community. And we also need guarantees that it will not happen again, which means that we will have to go back into the Constitution, open it up, and add some more securities for Black folks in America. So I think the bill is a great step forward. I think that the commission has done a good job in California. I would be interested to know how we can take it all across the nation and allow for Congress to act on HR 40. Now is the time. If we can shell out the resources that we've been seeing shelled out over the different media platforms over the past few years, we know that they can find the resources to repair and provide reparations for descendants of slavery. So again, I think it's a great step. I think that there may be some complications along with who should be able to qualify for a form of reparations to repair these families that are still feeling the effects, but also to include housing, zero interest loans for not only homes but businesses, and so many other considerations that should be brought forward. But I'll just for now stop there. But at this point, I think that there is a lot of work to do. There is a lot of creativity that is needed, and we can have a conversation amongst the states and also the territories but it really should be done at a national level. But if the local and the state leaders need to continue to charge forward, then we'll do that certainly. But there should be no reason why we are having this discussion still in 2022 after we have experienced over 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, and still so many injustices that are happening each and every day within communities all across these United States of America. So I am certainly in belief that this is a great step forward, but really looking forward to what the national leaders are going to do to help us at the state and local level provide some relief for families that were impacted by the effects of slavery. And again, one of the most atrocious acts and crimes against humanity.
Thank you so much. I have another question for you, Ms. McCurdy, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Has there been any conversation about this? I know there were a few things in the Nevada legislature last session that brought up, as you stated, small things that were like chipping at the bit to try to get there instead of just a broad, just formal blanket, let's get it done. Is there anything you've heard about or know about in that area or that part?
Yeah, definitely. So what we do know is that last legislative session, there was an Assembly joint resolution to abolish the language slavery from our Constitution. And that's going to, as was stated, going to have to go through 2 legislative sessions, then to the voters to have that removed. So at best, we're looking at 5 to 6 years. So that was something that was done. But also, there was another policy that was brought forward, and I'm actually, proud to have been able to have voted and been a co-sponsor of this bill, which was a bill, Assembly Bill 267, which essentially, and it is one of the strongest laws in the country to compensate wrongfully convicted folks in our state and folks who are wrongfully imprisoned. And what that did was it allowed for up to $50,000 to $100,000 if you were wrongfully convicted. You may ask yourself, what does that have to do with reparations? We know that Black folks have been disproportionately impacted by the legal system. I can't call it a criminal justice system because it's not so just, but I'll say the legal system. And what that means is that there are a disproportionate amount of Black people who are wrongfully convicted. And that's just a fact. It's not William McCurdy's, facts, but these are facts that can be, that can be found online and that are absolutely documented by credible institutions. So that is a policy and that was passed here in the state of Nevada that will allow for folks who have been wronged by the legal system to have some type of, repair, if you will, to what has been taken from them. But there is much more to do in terms of policy at the state level. Again, I spoke to zero interest, not only home loans, but business loans. So if folks who are hearing the trigger word reparations get excited when they hear that, we have to go back and really realize that due to slavery and due to the amount of capital that was raised through the unpaid labor, forced labor of Africans in America, we know that we not only built America, not only through rail and through different buildings to include the Capitol building in Washington D.C., but also other countries. We farmed cotton. We had sugar. We farmed tobacco. We know that those 3 industries, and to include rice, those four products, they help to generate immeasurable amounts of wealth for multiple countries. So debt is owed. There's much to do at the national level. There's some things that we can do at the state level, but it has to come from national because it has to be paid for. We can bring forward certain considerations at the state level, but we are limited in the resources that we have. Let's be clear about that. So we have to go to the national level and to our congressional leaders to carry forward this message and really back it up with a bill. And then after that, back it up with a vote. And then let's go and back it up with passage and then in action of not only, again, financial resources, but also other considerations that can be had to include zero interest loans for business owners and homeowners, as well as looking at the educational system. It should be free for undergraduate students who are Black and who are descendants of slavery. There are many things that we can do to include the social, emotional needs that we have within our community. Again, we are still undiagnosed from the results of slavery, and we don't even know why we're walking around angry in some days, and sometimes we don't know why we're walking around depressed, but we are walking around with the baggage of our ancestors because they never got compensated for the work that they did to build not only this nation but other nations. So there's much to do, and I believe that we can do limited amounts of things here in Nevada, but a lot of the work, the bulk of the work is going to be done. It has to be done at the national level to repair, again, which means to mend and fix things that are broken and provide reparations to Black people in America.
Thank you so much. All that information is so true and important. And it does need to come from the federal government because at the end of the day, they allowed it. We're going to move on. We have our next panelist, Lilith Baran. And hi, Lily, how are you? The question we have is what, if any, knowledge do you have about any current forms of reparations? And I also want you to talk a little bit about your knowledge and implementation of some of those things as well.
Sure. My mind is just so overloaded by all the amazing things that the panelists before me have said. So thank you so much, everyone, for the amazing discussion. I do want to just call to attention what Rodney said in the chat about education and about how the true history of African American contributions, as well as the true history of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, etc., needs to be taught in schools for us to ever reckon with this. That's why it is a trigger word, because we simply have taken it out of curriculum. I can't tell you how much about actual history I had to relearn after receiving a diploma, and I'm sure that's the case for students from any background. A lot of us do not know and are still Googling and YouTubing and reading and, searching through archives to even find out information that should have been taught to us that we do know about white men. I know so many things about the contributions of white men to the world, and that's very disproportionate. It's not to say that they have more contributions, it's just that is where education is. So I would say one of the things that we were able to do was have some cultural competency as far as education, and I know we're working on that in the school districts, but it is incredibly difficult because all of us were not taught the actual history. So some folks are really having trouble reckoning with the past and what role their ancestors may have created in it. So some things that we are seeing are, nonprofits, individual nonprofits and Black-owned businesses having access to certain kinds of grants or loans, as well as people using, I know here locally, we pushed after George Floyd for some tangible efforts from our city council to use for members to choose to use discretionary funds to fund some of the nonprofits in our area that benefit Black youth and Black communities. But one of the biggest things and an easy lift that doesn't have to be federal would be addressing the outcomes of the way people who are marginalized, especially Black people in these neighborhoods, are experiencing climate change first. We are in hot spots in these neighborhoods, and it's very interesting because it is a group of people who came with a knowledge of farming and who built our agricultural system. However, we're the furthest away now, 400 years later, 200 years later, from a head of lettuce or from a farm. And so, taking away food sovereignty from the Black community and hyper advertising junk foods and, taking away public parks and taking away the knowledge of, how to put a seed in the ground is something that doesn't have to be federally legislated. It can just be something that we get together and use. Yes, exactly. Most of our communities are in food deserts, and that's by design. It's very important, and it's always been said that white people created the ghetto. The ghetto was not created by Black people. We did not make that for ourselves. No one would make that for themselves. So I think if we look around, especially if you live in a historically Black neighborhood now, I bet that there are lots that could be gardens, that could be community gardens, or small little steps like that really could be a change. And then in addition, I think another thing that we haven't really touched upon is the healing aspect that is needed within our community, and how that might have to come from us finding out where we came from. Right now, you have to pay $100 to get a DNA swab to figure out where you were stolen from. And that's a really deep reckoning that you have to have with yourself to understand that other people of other nationalities or other ethnicities are able to say, my family came over from this country and we were in this village and etc. And many Black people, including myself, like, we're not exactly sure. We don't know exactly what our traditions are, even what our names should have been. So those kinds of things, starting from the very root of that pain and that disconnection from who we actually are and where we actually came from, needs to be addressed at that level. And we can see it, now in the numbers that we have with mental health disparities in students and in Black individuals, or highest in suicide rates, etc. And I can't help but connect those two things as well. So I think investing in mental health, making this a public health crisis, like Governor Sisolak did do in the last legislative session. He did recognize that this is a public health crisis. Putting some action behind that kind of realization is going to be critical in this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. You stated that different forms of reparations can take place. Do you have any experience with that, and how did you get the buy-in from others to agree, right? Like, that's been mostly the problem. I think all of the panelists, everyone on here has stated, the minute you bring up reparations, it's triggering, and then there's other people like, why should I pay you? I didn't do anything. And it was also brought up on this panel that you benefited from it. It's not a tag against you. Like, how do we get people into this thought process? And it has to be done fairly quickly, because over time, it's been ingrained in us that reparations is a bad thing and just giving money doesn't solve a problem. How do we get out of that and get people to buy into a new concept?
Well, I have two thoughts that are predominant when you ask that question. Number one is, we have some families that are built on, that are extremely wealthy in our country, that do not have to be federally legislated against. They could just be taxed, that should be probably paying their taxes anyway. A lot of these billionaire old American families built that wealth on the backs of Black slave labor, and they are not being asked to pay anything. That is not something that every single person having to pay the same amount is not, I don't think, what we are envisioning. I think it would have to be who did benefit, because some of those families are still benefiting. And then another thing would just be the way that that I've been able to make any kind of pathway on this issue is just by demonstrating what happened. It's really a lack of knowledge. All I had to say was, did you know that Langston Hughes used to come to this street to my council member? They said, well, no, I didn't. Well, did you know that this was this and that? Did you know that this used to be this and this used to be that? It's really a lack of foundational knowledge about what the world looked like at a certain time that is shying people away from the idea of paying a reparation. And also, it is a lack of looking towards the future of what it looks like to invest in a community. This is already a community that you gave slavery and they gave you jazz music. I mean, what kind of exchange is that? Can you imagine if you gave them housing and you gave them food sovereignty and you gave them business equity? Then what are they going to give you? So it's a matter of educating folks about the neighborhoods that they live in, about what kind of things are in their HOA. A lot of HOAs still have discriminatory clauses in them. Those kinds of things can be addressed right now. I know UNR is doing research on that as we speak, but I think that most of it is just, as Rodney is saying too, yes, misinformation and disinformation is really the culprit here. And the more that we reach back to try to uncover the history that was intentionally covered up, I think we would all agree that we need to even the playing field and, pay what is due to these communities.
Thank you so much for all that information. I'm going to circle back. I have another question for Mr. Tamaki before we get into opening some of the Q&A for all of our folks that are online watching this. And I'm also going to ask some of our supporters if they have any thoughts as well. So Don, I had another question. What are the next steps for this California task force? I know you mentioned all of the areas that they've looked at, where the research was done. What's the next step? Like, where do you go from here?
So in September this year, we're going to have a new set of hearings that will continue through June of 2023. And the focus is, as I was saying, what should the forms of repair be? And what's California's responsibility? What does California owe descendants of those who were enslaved? And what policies that are rooted in anti-Blackness, anti-Black hatred need to be changed? For me, everything is on the table. And Japanese American redress and reparations, what was a check in the mail, but it also was educational programs and many other things to deal with the healing part that Lily, mentioned, as well as educating the American public that this happened. There's no equivalence between what my community experienced and 400 years of oppression, but it does serve as just one model of reparations. Of course, there are other instances of reparations paid, a lot of which just fell very short of really providing on the compensation part. In some ways, America has gone apology crazy without putting much anything behind it. So I think that has to be pushed directly. And so the brief answer is we're working that out. And, there have been suggestions tonight in this panel, all of which I think are on the table. There is some debate, maybe you probably are aware of those, of what constitutes true reparations as opposed to not. And for some of the leading scholars who are advancing, the dialogue, reparations has to be something that closes the wealth gap. But there are other things that really need attention. I can't imagine the task force ignoring those things in terms of policy and changes in the law, and things like, what William was talking about tuition and other things. So I expect there'll be an array of things that will be recommended to the California legislature, and there'll be an array of things to recommend to activists to push this up to the national level. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure we got that question in. All of the information, I know it was a lot of information, everyone, even when you've been in the space for a long time, just hearing different perspective, different ways in which reparations can be done, different things that have been done that we're working on. We're going to go ahead, and I would like to hear, I know we have some of our partner orgs on the line, and I wanted to see if any of them would like to make a quick comment before we move into some of the questions that we have in the chat. If you do have one, and you are from one of our partner and supporters, just kind of raise your hand so that I can see and call on you, and we can let you have a few words. Otherwise, if none of you have anything to say, I could go straight into some of the questions that are in our chat. Is Pastor Kelsey West on? Is, but not. All right, we're going to go ahead and we're going to move into some of our questions that have been put into the chat. So I will go ahead and start. I'm going to go back to some of them were asked early on. So we got to scroll back a bit. So we have a question here, and most of these questions, if they don't mention a particular panelist, I will allow whomever wants to answer it to go ahead and get their thoughts on it. The first one is, has there been discussion of including loan forgiveness as a part of reparations for American descendants of African enslaved persons and close the wealth equity gaps? I know that was slightly mentioned briefly by some, but does anyone want to take that particular question?
I'll take a stab at it. I know it's been brought up recently with the Nevada Democratic Black Caucus. They did pose some of those questions to Senator Rosen's office when she asked about, what is it that would help and help the Black community. We also saw, and I hate to leave out our Indigenous brothers and sisters as well, that they did make headway on a free college bill, and they also as well deserve all of the same reparations for the harms done to their community, as well as this is their land in the first place. But I think that following in step with something like that and expanding that towards Black people would be helpful. We've seen it done, at least for one community. It can be replicated.
Awesome. Any other thoughts from any other panelists? If not, we're going to go on to our next question. Okay, this one is a little long. I'm going to try to read it as clearly and concise and quickly as I can. One of the most efficient ways of moving money into minority communities is within government procurement. Other states have established strong DBE, which is Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, and MBE, Minority Business Enterprise programs, where certification is granted to businesses with owners that fit within the above. Nevada's certification process here is incredibly weak. With a stronger certification process created by the state, could a micro reparations model at the local, regional, and state levels be easier to effectuate?
I'll just jump in here. I do know that there has been conversation at the state level regarding government procurement. I do know, as well as what's happening here at Clark County. I know that we have, I think we're at about 30% DBE, ACE DBE participation at the airport. And it's probably one of the strongest in the country. But I know that there is so much more work to do just in terms of getting folks educated. I recently held a workshop to give folks the information on how to become ACE DBE certified so they can, be competitive to get opportunities to do business within the airport. But there are so many other things that we can do. Like when contracts come up, we can include some type of social equity and social justice language within a lot of these contracts when it comes time to to apply for them and so forth. So I know that we've started to look closer at that. Senator Dina Neal has been in the trenches on this at the state level for quite some time, but again, it takes a majority to get anything done, and I believe that with this renewed focus on equity within the Black community and trying to achieve some form of parity, that we are on the way to getting there. I don't believe that there is truly any real substitute for reparations, to be clear, but there are things that we can do to improve the quality of life for those who have been impacted by the effects of slavery and what has happened here in America.
Awesome, great. I'm actually going to switch. I'm going to do a little back and forth to switch it up a little bit. We're going to see if we have, do any of our panelists want to say anything? Michelle from SEIU.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much to the panel for being here tonight. This has been an amazing discussion. I just wanted to add, I heard so many wonderful and very educational comments, and thank you for talking about, especially when it comes to laws, and the best apology is change behavior, and continuing to do education, acknowledgement, respect, and equality and accountability, especially when it comes to overturning laws like having a right to work state and laws that have been based out of racism to keep us separated. And, at SEIU Local 1107 and just across the country, we are trying to organize home care workers. But again, home care workers are treated like they're the help. They make $9 an hour. They take care of our loved ones. And this is a way that it continues and it's perpetuated within our society, is that it's just okay, and it's not. So I definitely appreciate the conversation. And again, thank you for having this panel tonight.
Thank you for that. That's from the SEIU. I'm going to go also. I have another raised hand, Cato Amir. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any names. Can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you. How are y'all?
Good.
I would turn my camera on, but I don't think I can. So I want to ask Mr. Tamaki a question. I want to know, during the California task force, he voted against reparations being based on lineage. Now, I want to really ask him why, because that bothers me. Japanese Americans who were interned, they received reparations because of that lineage, that experience they went through. They didn't give it to all Japanese Americans. So why would he vote against reparations being for Black Americans who have gone through chattel slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, the racial massacres, destruction of Black Wall Streets, vagrancy laws, Zephyr's prisons? That did not happen to all Black people. That happened to those of us who are descendants of American slaves. So why would he apply a different standard to us that was not done to his people, the Japanese Americans?
Okay.
I think that's a fair comment. I think the analogy you're drawing is accurate. It's true. There were a few Japanese Americans who were living on the East Coast at the time, and they did not get sent to concentration camps, and they were not eligible for reparations. So I think that's a valid point. With respect to the vote, let me just be clear. The vote was 5-4. I was one of the 4 on the losing side of that. But now that the task force has spoken, I intend to carry out the will of the task force. I'm not going to relitigate that issue on some internal belief on this. I think the third point is that as far as compensating an unacknowledged, invisible, unrecognized class of harmed individuals, which are the ancestors who were enslaved, as well as the descendants of enslaved people, I completely agree that they should be recognized, compensated. They constitute a special class. The vote at that time was considering that, plus, in addition, consequences that have resulted not just from lineage-based descendancy issues, but just on the basis of anti-Black hatred. So healthcare, policing, housing, some of these others that continue to persist don't necessarily, it's not easy to solve those through tracing lineage. How do you deal with, as I was saying, Black women having 5 times the infant mortality as other ethnic groups? Do you explore that question and solve it by tracing lineage? So I was trying to pose a proposition that the task force could do both. They could honor and recognize an injured class, but they could also deal with the broader questions based upon anti-Black hatred. And as we were chatting before the session started, I don't think Derek Chauvin cared whether George Floyd was a descendant of an American slave or rather was a Black immigrant. The only thing that mattered was he was Black. And so I thought that the task force could make a statement that accommodated both. And that was the purpose for my vote. But irrespective of that, the task force has spoken. I think your point, Cato, is well taken. We're not going to relitigate that. I am for it, and I'm going to support it. So that's as close to giving you a sense of my feeling about that vote. I don't think we're that far apart.
No, that was great. That was great. We are right at 7 o'clock, and I just want to go ahead and thank everyone for taking the time out of their evening to be with us. I know there were still a few questions. I'm so sorry we didn't get an opportunity to get to some of them. Some of them are excellent questions. Some of them can be answered if you have questions about the California Task Force report. Some of those questions can be answered from that report. We can get links to that up for you. You can click on them. You can read all of the information from there. And as far as our next steps, everyone, I just want to share a personal thing. All of my life, we've heard about reparations, right? When you're little, we joke about it. We use it in a charismatic form. I'll pay you back when I get my reparations, or one day we'll get reparations. And we use it jokingly, but it's actually a serious thing. It's actually a real thing. Our court and justice system is set up to repair, to make a person whole again, to fix a wrong that was done. And that's all we're trying to do for Black and African Americans and the descendants of slaves, is we're trying to fix a harm. The harm has lasted for a crazy amount of time. And all of the issues that have stemmed from it, we can't even start to think about or imagine. We're just now touching the surface of how important and this is to try to fix. And I just want to thank all of our panelists who are amazing. I've learned so much. I hope we can do this again sometime. And I also want to thank everyone that took time this hour out of their evening to be with us to discuss this. And hopefully we can decide whether or not our state needs to have a conversation such as California, or decide what role we will play in this at the national and federal level. So thank you all, and I bid you good evening, and thanks so much. And if you are not already a member of the ACLU, please become one, because we have great conversations like this all the time.